John Berlau is an award-winning journalist, recipient of the National Press Club's Sandy Hume Memorial Award for Excellence in Political Journalism, and Senior Fellow for Finance and Access to Capital at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's a columnist for Forbes and Newsmax, has contributed to Financial Times, The Washington Post, Politico, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Times. He's a frequent guest on CNBC, CNN, Fox News, and Fox Business. John is the author of a wonderful book, George Washington Entrepreneur, which is how I became aware of your work, John. How our founding fathers' private business pursuits changed America and the world. He lives not far from Mount Vernon in Alexandria, Virginia, home of the subject of our discussion for today, George Washington. So, John, we're starting a new season of podcast exploring the arc of American entrepreneurship. And who better to start with than George Washington? Thank you for being with us.
Yes, he was the founding father and a founding father, and you could call him the founding father, the father of our country, and also you could say he was the founding entrepreneur because he went through many of the struggles that today's entrepreneurs doing, innovating and going through different businesses. He wasn't set to inherit Mount Vernon, being a middle son. That happened was by happenstance after he had already built himself as an entrepreneur due to the tragic death of his older brother. And his family didn't really have the funds after his fathers died to send him to college, unlike other founding fathers such as Jefferson. So he started out really as in the gig economy of his day as a freelance surveyor, learned how to acquire real estate. In fact, sometimes he would get paid with some of the things he surveyed. Then, when he did get control of Mount Vernon, would change from the tobacco, which he thought, correctly was ruining the soil, to wheat, and then integrated his wheat, growing with enterprises such as making flour and later whiskey, and just had to started a lot of different ventures, including being the first in America. He's also in addition to being known as the father of everything else, the father of the American mule, excuse me, because he had gotten, he had mixed like a French donkey, the jackass, with an American mare, and did that. What was the genetic engineering of its day? The mule, which was so helpful before these advanced tractors and pulling plows, much more so than a horse. And so many innovations, and then he helped other inventors with their innovations. I write in my book, George Washington Entrepreneur, just completely another side to him besides, all of the great things he did in founding our country. And it's a way to get to know him other than being, the face on the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, a full life shouldn't be a surprise, but he did so many important things. I mean, there's been many books written about him, many of which I've read, and I'm a fan of entrepreneurs and business. But there was no treatment until I'd read your book, really, of the details of some of the things that he did. You note in your book, because you looked at his correspondence, that and for this agricultural entrepreneur, it really warmed my heart, but that he wrote in great detail in his correspondence. Quoting your book, Washington wrote detailed, sometimes passionate letters about agriculture his entire life, end quote. And so you note that even during times of battles, when he was busy with battles during the Revolutionary War, he was writing very detailed letters with instructions to the managers back on Mount Vernon. How did you decide that you wanted to write this book, and why this? Again, my bias is always towards entrepreneurship, so I was going to be interested in it no matter what. But kind of what was your motivation to say, hey, there's this other side of George Washington that I think people need to understand more clearly?
Give a lot of credit to Mount Vernon itself and those who are running it. I mean, that itself, as I write in my book, is an entrepreneurial story. It was started, the efforts to preserve Mount Vernon was started mostly by women, the ladies' league of Mount Vernon, and when they saw it being in disrepair, and that was like 50 years before we had a National Park Service, and it has continued, with no, with no government funding, a completely private organization. And they decided about, I would say, maybe 15 years ago now to start celebrating some of the businesses that Washington built, the fishery, and they rebuilt the whiskey distillery. And it's actually now a working whiskey distillery based on Washington's old recipes, where you could see the technology with the water wheel, and they actually do make whiskey. In fact, I believe Mount Vernon is the only private organization in Virginia that has a license to sell, hard liquor like whiskey and brandy. The rest have to be sold like in state-run ABC stores, as opposed to beer and wine that you could buy in a grocery store. So it's really remarkable what they're doing at the modern Mount Vernon. I saw that and I'm like, I never knew that. But then, as I, like you, were writing about entrepreneurship and what are the barriers to entrepreneurship, what motivates people to be an entrepreneur, I said this would be a great way to get people, including, myself, who just, revered Washington, but really couldn't, maybe sympathize or empathize with him like some of the other founding fathers who are quoted more often, like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, to get to know him, because so many Americans face, not the same, but similar struggles on, on building their own businesses. So I started writing articles like for Forbes and National Review. I had a friend who was an agent and said, this would be a good book. And it took us about 5 years, getting rejections from publishers, but eventually I was fortunate, St. Martin's Press and edit um Adam Bellow's All Points books, label inside that, agreed to publish that, and worked with them, and I think have done, if I say so myself, a really good book that a lot of people have said they've learned from, and I've learned in the conversations about Washington from them.
Yeah, so you mentioned two other founders, Franklin and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, noted for a lot of talents themselves, but noted as creatives. And so one of my point with students in entrepreneurship class is that I think too often when we hear the word creative, we want to go to the artistic or humor or whatever. And certainly whether it's Jefferson with architecture or the scientific mind and the writing and the humor of Franklin, they were creatives, but that Washington had creativity as well. And so you noted him taking Mount Vernon from not being much to being something. Can you describe kind of Washington's creativity and the role and ultimately the agricultural business that he formed over the course of
Well,
decades?
Washington's genius and his really creativity was, as far as building businesses and integrating them. I mean, he stopped growing tobacco, which was a process that took a number of years, but he just stopped, basically cold turkey, because he thought it was harming the soil. He thought, tobacco was for export, subject to British duties. If he grew wheat, he could import that. I mean, he could actually sell within domestic markets, so wouldn't be as dependent on exporting that. And he looked for inspiration at some of the smaller farmers, like the German immigrant farmers who were growing wheat, and said, that you could really do this even more efficiently on a big farm. And so he began growing wheat, and plus, other types of crop, including hemp, although there's no evidence he smoked marijuana, but he would use the hemp like for fish nets and things like that. And he would really integrate, some of these enterprises after building hemp, built after growing wheat. He built and improved upon a flour mill that was there, that would just basically make branded flour with the GW initials on it, and export, even when we were a colony, to Great Britain, to the British territories in the Caribbean, all over the world. And it had sort of pioneered branding almost with a trademark before 100 years before the branding. The people we think of as the branding pioneers, like H.J. Heinz. Also, he would use the hemp, for fish nets, and then with the rest, he would have different types of fish that they would, catch, like maybe hundreds of thousands of pounds, like including herring, shad, other things, and then use the fish guts again for fertilizer
Yeah,
for the wheat.
really good fertilizer.
Yes,
Yeah, so again, I think it's easy in the modern world to be like flour, yeah, whatever. But you note in the book that it wasn't necessarily the common thing at that point. People bought wheat and ground it at home. And so
yes,
his test was like, can I grind it, charge more for it so that I can make more money than just selling wheat as a
yes,
commodity, but then have consistent enough quality that I can put a brand on it, essentially his own
right.
brand. So G. Washington flour. And
Yes, G. Washington flour. Yes.
I mean, that is just so interesting. And so you traced a little bit in the beginning, but I'd like to come back to this just a little bit more. We love the story in America, of course, of the self-made person. And you do note that he was very much that. Again, I think perhaps the perception because of his stature as a founding father and even sort of the brand of Mount Vernon was that he was very successful and inherited it. Now, I think he married pretty well, so maybe that helped. But can you talk about kind of how you think about that arc from when he was young, starting as a surveyor to becoming having a very successful agricultural business by the end of his life?
Well, yes. As we discussed, he wasn't exactly destitute, and he did had some education when he was young, but for all purposes, when his father died and when he was 11, that's when his formal education ended. And a couple of years later, he would basically be in the working world at 13 and 14. He grew up actually, his father had owned Mount Vernon, but his older brother Lawrence had basically been left that, and he grew up with his mother. Lawrence was his half brother, actually. His father's first wife who had passed, and his father. He was the oldest child with the second wife, Mary Ball Washington, and he had grown up in like um in near Fredericksburg, and what today is called Ferry Farm wasn't. I've been there. Wasn't nearly as isn't and wasn't nearly as glamorous as Mount Vernon. Although I applaud the effort to preserve and basically that had been taken down, had to rebuild that farm there and what they are doing there. But when Washington went to Mount Vernon, it was a new world opened up for him. He did make some contacts with the Fairfax County, the Lord Fairfax, the namesakes now of Fairfax County, and did some surveying work for them, and then did some of the freelance surveying work, including what is now the downtown of Alexandria, Virginia, where I live, and so had really been able, and he conducted surveys at Mount Vernon for the rest of. Really for the rest of his life. I think the last survey he did was a couple months beforehand, and people are still, I mean, surveying is still a vital occupation today. I've talked to some of the surveyor associations about that. But so by the time he married Martha, and he did marry well, Martha also married well with her first husband and was a savvy businesswoman too. He had already basically built up, owning several pieces of real estate that he used from his surveying earnings, or frequently would just take the real estate as payment. So he had been a self-made man before he married Martha, made him that made him richer. And the skills he had as an entrepreneur, he would always, use throughout his life so that he wouldn't get trapped like in a crop that, didn't, wasn't would turn out to be, ruinous to the soil and subject to, British edicts, that and then we use with Martha's help, they would make a bunch of things like with a textile mill, the blacksmith shop, and I say some people decry the mattress ads for what we call President's Day. It's actually still officially Washington's birthday, but I say it's some ways, if you understand it, it's going back to the transition, because mattresses and things like bed ticking were some of the things that George and Martha's textile mill made.
Well, and items again too easily taken for granted in today's day and age, but not so much back
Yes.
then. Yeah, so he showed these great builder habits of just trying things. And then, even on today's farms, we talk about the importance of diversification, but at least in the Midwest, that might mean two different kinds of crops, maybe a couple of different kinds of livestock. But you wrote in your book, I mean, he experimented with, perhaps didn't scale, but experimented with something like 60 different crops.
60 different crops, and he had like a whole repository for different types of manure. He was fascinated with what type of manure to use, and just generally different types of fertilizers. So very, very creative, and just yeah, as far as was a pioneer as far as crop rotation, as you mentioned too. So.
And just trying to get out of, yeah, commodity production, branded flour instead of wheat, preserved fish products that, can be stored and branded as well because there's a river that runs through his backyard and there's
Right, the Potomac River, yes.
a fishing season essentially. One of the other skills that you wrote nicely about in the book for entrepreneurs is about networking, your ability to connect with people, to find people you need who can help you with the right skills at the right time. Seems to me he had just exceptional networking skills. Can you describe those skills and the ways that he developed them over the course of time and how those networking skills bore fruit as he got further
Well,
into his career and founding the company?
Washington networked with a lot of people. I mean, he sort of cultivated, he used the Fairfax family library. That was sort of and they were sort of Lord Fairfax and his cousin, and that were sort of mentors, and he would use their library to read the books. By the way, even though he wasn't educated, past basically what would then be his education as a teenager, the formal schooling. He was his he would read for the rest of his life. Was very much self-taught, would read everything from the Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations to a lot of books about agriculture, and correspond. One thing with some agriculturalists, he would correspond, of the authors of the books were around, or some of them that were in England. Washington would write just a series of letters about what they thought about, this crop or that crop. And he was interested in building, say, a greenhouse to grow citrus. He had made a trip with his brother Lawrence when his brother Lawrence was sick. The only trip he made where he was, you could say that was overseas, where he left the U.S. landmass to Barbados, and just loved things like the pineapple and some of the citrus fruits. So wanted to grow oranges and things like that there. And he corresponded with the Carroll family in Maryland, who the sort of a pioneering Catholic family. Charles Carroll, from the same, who was a relative of the lady he corresponded with. Margaret Carroll was like the only Catholic signer of the direct Declaration of Independence. And I mean, this is another thing in my book, that Washington was very open toward Catholics and Jews, those who were both victims of prejudice there. So Washington would really speak to people from all walks of life. And he also cultivated a relationship with artists and writers. He would give people copy of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and hosted Thomas Paine actually at the home he was staying in New Jersey during in the last days of the war. And there was even a scientific experiment that he did with Thomas Paine, that Paine later wrote about, where they basically discovered natural gas in the river there. So and
Really?
some scientists I've talked to said that experiment was even more important than Franklin and the kite.
Hopefully they didn't start too big of a fire.
Right, the fire on that you could start a fire on the water. So
Yeah, yeah.
was it something that Payne later wrote about? You could find out, and it was where the natural gas is around today in southern New Jersey and Pennsylvania.
So, yeah, openness to other people that may not be in socially accepted circles, whether it's Catholic or Jews. Where do you think that came from in Washington's character? Because that, again, you think about prime entrepreneurial traits. sometimes the best idea come from the strangest people or unexpected people or people you don't normally mix with. So that seems good, but um,
Well,
I'm not sure it would have been common of his social class.
Washington, when he did surveyor camps, he did, he mixed with a lot of people when he was in I think part of that is military. He served in, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War and got to know a lot of the soldiers. I think through his readings, he did that. And then in the war of necessity of getting along with the French and the Canadian and some of the Canadian settlers in what is now Canada who were Catholic. He ended a practice where some of the soldiers would, do burn like a something of burn a figure of the Pope in effigy and things like that, and he calls an immediate halt to that. There's strong evidence he gave money to start the first Catholic church in Virginia when Catholics were at the time victims of persecution almost more than they were in Virginia, almost than they were in England. They couldn't pray publicly or serve on juries, but Washington had one of his top aides in the war was Colonel John Fitzgerald, who later actually became part of the Washington administration, and then Washington's appointed to the company he helped form to improve navigation on the Potomac River. So he was very open to all, different ethnic groups at the time and
Yeah,
actually spread the message of religious freedom. He wrote to the Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island that this is the children of Abraham, meaning Jews will live, in freedom under their own vine and fig tree, where um, no one will and actually said, bigotry and hatred have no place here. And so he very much, I mean, had, what today we would consider progressive, hopefully normal, but progressive views on the different religious freedom.
yeah. Um, so you mentioned the distillery earlier, and I found that just a really interesting example at the end. He was distilling whiskey and flavored whiskeys. It's like we have flavored hard spirits today, made vinegars, brandies. And you note that it became, I think you used the word instantaneously, the most profitable part of the operation. But it kind of occurred towards the end of his life, unfortunately. He passed away, unfortunately, from my perspective, at this point of life, at least kind of young. And so you wonder what it would have become. But, again, today we think about business model innovation, whether you think about Airbnb instead of a hotel or Uber instead of calling a taxi or whatever. That's all business model innovation.
Well,
But
and
he
and of
was he
course
was doing it.
with the whiskey distillery, let me say this is another thing where he was open, to people of different ethnicities, different stations. He asked his Irish migrant, his Irish Catholic migrant friend John Fitzgerald about, who was a rum merchant himself. What was is this a good idea? And because who would more, if we get from his mind, who would know more about whiskey than the Irish? And then his Scottish land manager James Anderson was the one who approached him with the idea. So again, Washington was listening to other people and their life experiences that really helped him with that, build a success. And that's what entrepreneurs need today.
Well, and we see farms in Iowa and other states as well, yeah, building distilleries for value-added agriculture. It's like George Washington was working on this quite profitably a very long time ago. So, thinking about the environment that Washington was in when we think about the transition that he was so involved with of being a British colony, declaring independence, forming a country, writing a constitution, being first president, all that stuff. Um, we might think classically from our history classes or our readings about Stamp Act or Don't Tread on Me flag or no taxation without representation. And most certainly those things are important, but I find the stories like you wrote about economic freedom really interesting as well, because that seems to me, at least, and that's what I want to ask you about, to be very much in the currents of what drove people like Washington to think about independence in the first place. And so, the British policies were what the economists today might call mercantilist. They wanted the Americans to spend their metal coins on British goods imported, and then they didn't want to have to spend their own coins on commodities that we were shipping them. So it just was a struggle, in that Parliament passed acts that prohibited certain kinds of manufacture in the United States. And so you're
Yes.
you're right that Washington was worried about some of these value-added enterprises of his being shut down by the British. So I just, and you noted, and you mentioned this earlier, he read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations that was published in 1776. Two big things happened in 1776. That book was published, and we had this Declaration of Independence. Anyway, you note that he had that book, and that there are notes written in the margins that probably are his. How do you think about, you know, kind of the role of economic freedom in what became the independence movement, and it moving people like George Washington towards firmer ideas of the United States of America as an independent country from it being independent from the British?
I think it's very important, and it's important. I think we can relate to some of the struggles we have today to understand why or what motivated the founders to, what were the specific complaints that later led to a call for universal human rights, and it was some of trampling on what they thought were some of their rights as Englishmen, but it was no more than just the level of taxes. It was just the taxes were the as historian Woody Holton, actually is kind of a progressive historian, said the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. They were subject, the Navigation Acts subject them to the British trade monopoly. Washington couldn't buy like the best salt, Portuguese salt, for his fish, as you mentioned, and salt back then, was used as it was the main preservative. He had to
Mhm.
use the Liverpool salt, which would dissipate. But then other things like there were acts like the Iron Act, like you couldn't make finished goods with iron, including nails. And then the Hat Act, where you couldn't make hats here. The Wool Act, as far as some of the things like blankets or covers or things like that. Everything. It was just not just competition from other countries. The British manufacturers were jealous of any form of domestic competition, the small factories, and of course Washington was going into that, and he wondered, well, if they can do that, if they can put these new stamp taxes, can they just shut down my factories? And he wrote an impassioned letter to George Mason in 1769. George Mason himself would become a significant founding father, who's Gunston Hall was pretty close and still is pretty close to Mount Vernon, and said, what can we do about this? And that was the first time he had contemplated taking up arms. And but he had thought about, his own thing. Could they he used the term my manufacturing. Could they shut down my manufacturing? And then Washington and Mason would later draft in 1774. We just last year celebrated the sesquicentennial of this, the Fairfax resolves about all of these, these alarming, actions by the British, and also there was a list of grievances, and also talking about things like, for the first time, that they called the slave trade a cruel, unnatural trade, and they called for ending the slave trade, if not slavery itself. So Washington would later, come to, privately in his writings, abhor slavery, and he would ended up freeing all of the enslaved workers that he owned outright. There were some legally he couldn't free, like things that belonged to Martha's children from her first husband, but like about 124 enslaved workers he would free, and was all in like the Fairfax Resolves, which greatly influenced the Declaration of Independence. it, was presented to the Continental Congress, and I think Jefferson was familiar when he wrote that. So, um, very much so that it was the economic grievances I think gave Washington, being treated as subjects would later give Washington, and I would say the other founding fathers, sympathy or empathy with the enslaved, and then there were abolitionists at the time, and progress being made, including the Northwest Ordinance, which put like much of our new territory off limits to slavery.
Yeah,
I
he
mean,
would
no,
have.
they weren't perfect, of course, on the issue, but I mean, I think, that it was an accepted practice throughout the world, where, had made some, had started, asking the right questions, which would later lead to, its abolition.
Yeah. So a question about entrepreneurship and culture. You note in the book that inventors didn't have a very positive public perception in the 1780s, so the kind of founding decade for the country. Um, I've seen evidence in other histories of the same sort of prejudice towards merchants, builders, entrepreneurs, whatever. George Washington, you note in his first address to Congress in 1790, called for the encouragement of inventions. How do you think that whole thing is important to the founding of the country and kind of our culture today, that uh, to admire invention, enterprise, economic freedom?
Oh, it is so important. It is so important with Washington's praise of the inventors, which sort of, coincided with the Constitution's constitutional protection of patents. And yes, inventors, before then had sort of been seen as crackpots, and unrealistic dreamers. But Washington, even as a private citizen, even before he was president, after he came back from being general and had some sway, there was someone in the western part of Virginia, I think, Berkeley Springs. Well, it's now Berkeley Springs. It was Bath, Virginia. Now Berkeley Springs, like West Virginia. James Rumsey, who Washington wanted to be him to build a house for him out there, but saw an experiment he was doing with a mechanical boat, and wrote to the legislature and saying, applying, there wasn't a constitution, so this was in the mid 1780s. There wasn't a U.S. patent office, but he said this is, he appealed for Rumsey to have a patent on this so he could continue to experiment. Later hired Rumsey for the Potomac Company, and Rumsey in 1787, the same year as our Constitution, and John, as well as another inventor called John Fitch, made the first, working steamboats that Robert Fulton would later, like Henry Ford did with the automobile, that Robert Fulton would later, about 20 years later, perfect and get funding for, and make commercially successful. And they cut down like things like travel from Louisville to New Orleans, like for a number of days. And of course our early railroads and factories were also done by steam. Instead, steam really was the fuel that we started, all coming from the steamboat. And Deirdre McCloskey, a writer on economic trends and innovation, or innovism as she called it, that said it was not just the things that the inventors invented, but the culture that respected them, that began in America, went to Britain, and then spread all over the world, was what really was responsible for the era of innovation that began, shortly after America was founded, and we're still living through this day, that has given us all these great things, all the way you could trace it from the steamboat to AI.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Deirdre McCloskey and her work on the intersection of culture and economics and entrepreneurship and economic freedom. I mean, I think she refers to kind of cultural issues. Anyway, she asked, like, what is the sweet talk? What do people compliment? What do people hold up? And that it's an exception in history for people to hold up invention, innovators, entrepreneurs, risk-taking, all of that sort of thing in high regard. And that was part of the cultural change that was coming on. I think sort of the British country gentleman culture was, if you made some money doing something, you wanted, yeah, to retire to be the country gentleman. and you don't
The
work.
landed gentry. Well, Washington was challenging that when he, unlike his neighbors, I mean, there was the tobacco were actually planters and the rest were farmers. When Washington started planting weed, I mean, that's the thing. He was looked at askance, by some of his neighbors, some of the people. He was in the social class, basically the higher one, since, marrying Martha and serving in the French and Indian War. Yet he did that, but there's evidence that even in being chosen as the general for the Revolutionary War by the Continental Congress, that played a role, that people were familiar with his brand, because it's still uns there's still some uncertainty as to why, as if people don't know, you can't, he couldn't put like his exploits on Instagram or things like that, like we do today, or even TV or radio, how so many people knew about him. Well, the flower was sold throughout the country, and Adams specifically mentioned one of the reasons for nominating Washington was his quote, independent fortune. So the brand got to be known even despite the marketing devices then, and it translated into Washington was the kind of guy we needed to use his innovation talents to win the war.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to overestimate the importance of Adams from New England being willing to nominate somebody from Virginia to that leadership position. And I had missed completely that, yeah, essentially Washington's acumen in business and the brand around that was part of the aura that was around him. He's like, well, he can run a business successfully. Hopefully, he can run an army too.
There was a lot more. It's certainly worth further study as to what some of the reasons and how well known his flower was.
Hmm. So, you note in your book that Washington was able to try his hand and advance rapidly in fields of surveying. You talked about that earlier in real estate because there was relatively free entry. He could just do it at 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. He could get trained up and do surveying and of new land. What lessons do you think we can draw today on the state of free enterprise? Um, on things like licensing and things. Yeah, we've made some progress in Iowa, but one of the absurd licensing regimes was on braiding hair. And we got rid of that. We probably still have a ways to go. Anyway, there's been stories about this stuff, but what would George Washington think of regulation, taxes, and government in the United States today, if you had to take your best guess based upon having done this deep dive into his character and life?
I did a whole part of a whole chapter about what Washington would think. And Washington, as we discussed, was so open to innovation that one of the things he did was, as president, was he welcomed, the balloon basically was the first, device where, with manned flight. And that was beginning in France in the 1780s. And the French balloonists visited America, and Washington basically gave them, passage, and had a big ceremony for them. And he wrote to what in a letter, someday the Frenchmen might be coming here, quote, flying through the air. So he could even envision before the railroad something like an airplane. So I think he would really love some of the inventions. I put that he would love things like cryptocurrency, given that he used methods of encryption, pre-computer like invisible ink, and other things with his spy ring. But I think he really would not like the government just being the regulation without representation we still have, where it's not made by law but made by like an agency, sort of stretching the law. He talked about that the in his farewell address, which is most noted for foreign policy. He talked about, agencies, the executive, legislative, judicial, staying within in their spheres of influence, in their proper spheres, and saying we can amend the Constitution if necessary, but we don't need that. So I think very much the mandates and the licenses you need, as you said, over certain things that he had that like surveying I mean, surveying can still be like a viable path forward by someone who doesn't graduate college, and in some states I've learned that, and there's still a need. And the website Angie recommends, you do a survey every time you sell your home, because you never know what, building a deck or someone, could change the boundaries. So that's just one thing that Washington started. And by the way, Jefferson, as I write in the book, Jefferson and Lincoln had experience being surveyors too. So some people call Mount Rushmore a monument to surveyors, but I think the red tape, the licensing, the fact that that you have the administrative state doing, making laws rather than, Article 1, Section 1, all laws in the legislative branch would be distressing to him.
Well, I have to smile at you say he would love crypto and yeah, his spy communication with the invisible ink and all that stuff. But I have to think too, just the struggles the colonies had with money and what is money and what is good money? Because they certainly had some experiments with things that weren't good money. The
And
con
some things that work with incredibly well. I have said, I've written in the book, and I've made this. I don't know if I made the analogy in the book, but I've said the tobacco warehouse receipts were like the Bitcoin of its day, where you would write something that, a note for like this, I will pay you this much of tobacco, and those would get circulated to third parties, and you basically would pay them as money up until I think the early 1800s. That basically you had money backed by tobacco, when some of the state experiments and money didn't work. It was something tied to a fixed commodity. So it was, before there were gold discoveries and mints and things like that here. The tobacco warehouse receipts was, kind of the currency of choice. It was it was the Bitcoin of his day. So the thing he would be familiar with encryption, with alternative money, and with he always loved, and I've seen some of his ledgers he kept in Mount Vernon. He was very good at, keeping ledgers of what, his accounts owed and things like that, and just had a head for numbers that would so all of those things together, I think he would really be fascinated by crypto.
Well, John, again, my compliments on your book and suggest to everybody listening and watching, it's a good read. You can see all my sticky notes that I have on it from when I read it for the first time a few years ago, probably at this point. But thank you for taking the time and thank you for the book and thank you for your contributions to free enterprise.
Thank you so much for having us on. And if you want to know more about my work and my organization, I mean, the book is available on websites where books are sold, but also the Competitive Enterprise Institute website is cei.org.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.